দর্শক আমন্ত্রণ জানাচ্ছি চ্যানেল 24 এর নিয়মিত আয়োজন মুখোমুখিতে প্রতি পর্বে আমাদের সাথে কখনো দেশি কখনো বিদেশি অতিথি থাকেন এবং আমরা একটি সুনির্দিষ্ট বিষয়ে তার কাছ থেকে জানার চেষ্টা করি, বোঝার চেষ্টা করি, শেখার চেষ্টা করি। আজকে আমাদের সাথে তেমন একটি গুরুত্বপূর্ণ ব্যক্তি আমাদের সাথে আছেন লীনা খান, লেবার অ্যাটাশে ইউএস এম্বাসি। ওয়েলকাম টু দ্য শো।
Thank you, Hasib. It's great to be here today.
So, Lina, you were one of the first labor attaché for U.S. Embassy in Dhaka, and there are only few in the whole world. So that means USA is putting a lot of importance on the labor issue. Let's begin with that.
Well, first of all, again, thank you for having me on the show. And yes, the United States has a few labor attachés around the world, and I've been serving as the U.S. Department of Labor's attaché here at the U.S. Embassy in Dhaka for nearly a year and a half now.
Okay.
And as the attaché, I work with all U.S. agencies and departments to really ensure that labor rights are embedded in our policy engagements with the government of Bangladesh. You know, the United States is placing close attention on labor in Bangladesh and around the world. As you may know, President Biden signed a memorandum last year in November to improve labor rights globally, and this is known as the U.S. Global Labor Strategy.
Right.
So it is a top priority of the Biden administration to improve the rights of freedom of association and collective bargaining so that workers are, really able to have a voice and a seat at the table when it comes to their rights. We are very interested in the labor situation here in Bangladesh.
Right.
And the United States has had a long history of supporting worker rights in Bangladesh through technical assistance, through labor and trade policy, as well as through the International Visitor Leadership Program and labor programming. So, as we look ahead, we really want to ensure that workers are able to exercise their fundamental rights to freedom of association and collective bargaining. And these rights are really going to become increasingly important in our trade and our economic policy discussions.
In the coming days.
In the coming days and years to come, yes.
Right. On this labor memo announced by the White House, there is a criticism it's another political tool. Would you agree or you disagree?
Again, the global labor strategy, the memorandum, really is focused on uplifting workers' rights around the world as well as domestically. This is not to be viewed as a tool to penalize countries, but really as a way to work in closer collaboration with countries, with partners, with our trade partners. So again, this is a way to strengthen collaboration and cooperation to advance our our goals of mutual interest, which is economic development and prosperity for both of our countries.
Right. So you spend 1.5 years here, and your focus is on the labor issue, and definitely you have your priorities. You met with so many people from the government side to the labor worker activists and the worker organizers, and then buyers as well, also your like-minded colleagues. So how's your working area? What are your learnings? And how do you see the people's inspiration of changing the whole scene?
Thank you. I mean, these are all very important questions. Let me first start by the areas that I'm focusing on here in Bangladesh. So, my work really focuses on advancing internationally recognized worker rights. These rights are the right to freedom of association and collective bargaining. These are the elimination of child labor and the abolition of forced labor. This is also about acceptable conditions of work, such as occupational safety and health, hours of work, and wages. And we see that these rights are essential to ensuring that labor standards are not lowered, as a means to draw greater investment and trade to Bangladesh. In Bangladesh, we are also giving greater attention to freedom of association, including through labor law reform. Bangladesh is undergoing a labor law reform process to the Bangladesh Labor Act. And we are working very closely with the government to ensure that the reforms make it easier for workers to form and join trade unions. For example, by lowering the threshold for union formation. That's one way to make it easier. We also want to see reforms to the Bangladesh Labor Act that would provide greater protections for workers that experience unfair labor practices and acts of anti-union discrimination. And then we also would like to see greater protections for workers in the export processing zones, in the EPZs. Currently, workers are legally prevented from forming or joining trade unions in the export processing zones, and this is a violation of international labor standards. And we believe that workers everywhere, regardless of the zone or the sector in which they work, or whether they're informal or formal workers, all workers should be able to exercise their right to organize and advocate for better working conditions.
So on this issue, I have another question. I have two questions.
Okay.
The first one is, how do you see, or what's your observation on the new wage announced by the government? And also, what are your priority areas? Who are the stakeholders you work with?
Sure. So first, regarding the wage policy, the minimum wage that was announced last year in the ready-made garment sector, you know, our objective is really to ensure that the process is inclusive, and so that the process around the wage setting process includes the voices of independent labor unions, of employers, and other key stakeholders. You know, our concern is, we were very concerned to see the violence around the minimum wage protests. In particular, it was very concerning to see that hundreds of workers as well as labor activists were arrested during the minimum wage protests. And while they have been released, we continue to hear that they are facing criminal charges. So, you know, we believe that workers should be able to exercise their right to peaceful assembly and right to legal protest, and they should not be criminalized for exercising in legal protest activities. And as far as the wage setting number goes, we want to see, you know, a fair process, again, that is inclusive, that really does take into consideration the realities that workers in the garment sector are facing with respect to rising inflation, and the overall situation is pretty challenging. So again, we want to see a process that is truly listening to the voices of workers so that the end result is fair and equitable.
And you shared all these thoughts with your when you meet all the stakeholders?
Yes, absolutely. I think that, you know, we are very clear about our position that we want to ensure, again, that workers have a seat at the table.
Right.
And, you know, you asked me about which stakeholders I work with. You know,
Sure.
I work with stakeholders all across the board. I work very closely with the government of Bangladesh. I work closely with trade union federations and labor leaders. I work with the private sector as well as industry associations. And we also work very closely with like-minded governments and the International Labor Organization. You know, and it's really important to recognize that all stakeholders have a key role to play in improving labor rights in Bangladesh and around the world. You know, the government must develop strong laws and enforce those laws, particularly to hold those accountable for acts of anti-union violence, discrimination, and retaliation. Suppliers, they must keep their workplaces safe and ensure that workers are able to exercise their right to organize. Brands and buyers, they have a very important role to play by ensuring that workers in their supply chains are able to organize and bargain collectively. And you know, it's also important that brands play a role in ensuring that workers have access to remedy when their rights at the workplace have been violated. And finally, independent democratic unions, they empower workers to negotiate with their employers for higher wages and better working conditions.
I had a question, that is the new action plan by US. It proposed, it's been shared with the concerned authorities, and my first question would be, is there any timeline, and is it also aligned with the labor roadmap government shared with ILO that is about to be done by next 2 years, I guess?
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you, Hasib, for this important question. So yes, the United States has recently presented Bangladesh with a new labor action plan. And we developed this labor action plan in part as a response to Bangladesh's request for access to trade benefits under the U.S. Generalized System of Preferences, or GSP. Bangladesh lost GSP preferences in 2013 due to serious concerns over labor rights. So the U.S. Labor Action Plan now outlines 5 key areas where the United States would want to see progress. Okay. These are, number 1, labor law reform with a focus on the right to freedom of association and collective bargaining. Number 2 is preventing violence, harassment, and retaliation against workers and labor leaders for their trade union activity. 3 is ensuring accountability for anti-union unfair labor practices and anti-union discrimination. 4 is addressing barriers to trade union registration. And 5 is improving the resources and capacity for labor inspectors and labor enforcement. Now, regarding your question on the ILO roadmap, so, you know, the United States has a very specific statutory requirement for its trade preference programs, such as the Generalized System of Preferences. Bangladesh would need to demonstrate substantial progress on internationally recognized worker rights for any reconsideration of GSP benefits after our U.S. Congress reauthorizes the program.
So it's been reauthorized? That's what I'm thinking. Because
well, actually, it's not. It's expired, but it is under the process of being reconsidered by our Congress. But I cannot speak on when that would happen. But when and if the Congress reauthorizes the GSP program, and if Bangladesh is interested in reapplying for it, it would have to demonstrate that it has made substantial progress on internationally
on those 5 areas.
On those 5 areas, as well as any other criteria that that the new statute might include. So these 5 areas just outline sort of it's the broad strokes. Now, I also wanted to mention that the U.S. Labor Action Plan and the ILO roadmap are complementary and very similar in scope. So there really aren't any surprises under what's in the U.S. Labor Action Plan. Now, on the timeline, Bangladesh has committed to implementing the ILO roadmap by the end of 2026. Right. Now, since the U.S. Labor Action Plan and the ILO roadmap share similar goals and objectives, we would expect the Labor Action Plan to be implemented over a similar time frame.
Right. And when you presented all these action plan with the concerned authorities, what was their first impression?
Well, I mean, I think the initial impression that we have received is appreciation and welcoming that the United States has outlined in very clear terms what it expects on labor rights.
Right. So how do you perceive the current status of labor relations and worker rights in Bangladesh, and how can Bangladesh address those challenges? And I have a link to this, another question of this, because we recently have ILO hearing. Of course, it's not your part to describe what Bangladesh has done in the ILO hearing, but as it is interlinked. So what are the challenges?
Sure. Well, again, this is a very important question. So on the current state of labor relations, I think I just want to take a little bit of a step back and just first mention that Bangladesh has really made important progress over the past 10 years on safety, monitoring, and remediation, particularly in the export ready-made garment sector. The International Accord was a highly effective body in improving building, fire, and structural safety following the 2013 Rana Plaza disaster that killed over 1,100 workers and injured thousands more. The accord was successful because it was a binding industry agreement that held both brands and suppliers accountable for labor rights violations. And today, there's the Ready-Made Sustainability Council, which is continuing some of the important work of the accord, for example, by ensuring that factories are compliant and remain compliant on fire and building safety. And we hope to see that this work continues.
Right.
We also welcome that Bangladesh is continuing to reform and improve its labor laws. But at the same time, we have some serious concerns over anti-union violence, over the harassment, retaliation, and unfair labor practices against workers and trade union leaders for exercising their right to organize. And we're also concerned over a climate of impunity and the lack of remedies that currently do not exist for workers who come under attack for organizing. And as I mentioned previously, we were very concerned to see the arrests of hundreds of workers in last year's minimum wage protest, and the fact that many workers continue to face criminal charges for legal protest activities. Bangladesh can really address these issues by ensuring that workers can freely organize and collectively bargain and are not targeted and are not harassed and are not criminalized for legitimate trade union activities. And, progress on these issues would really send a strong message to the international community that Bangladesh is serious about protecting the rights of its workers.
Concerned authorities, especially Foreign Ministry or Labor Ministry or Commerce Ministry or Trade Ministry, what's the reflection and how they take it?
Well, thank you for the question. We have been engaging very closely with the government of Bangladesh for several years on a number of issues on labor rights. And, as far as my work goes over the past year or so, I have had some very productive conversations with the Ministry of Labor, with the Law Ministry, on a range of issues from labor law reform to addressing acts of anti-union violence, unfair labor practices, trade union registration. Given that the Bangladesh Labor Act is undergoing reforms, that has really taken a lot of our attention in terms of our bilateral engagements. And, we've been having very targeted, very specific discussions on how we can work together on addressing some of the provisions in the labor law that would help workers organize, that would lead to greater and more harmonious industrial relations between workers and employers. And again, we are trying to find ways to move forward so that we can remove some of the barriers in the law that would really foster an enabling environment for workers to exercise their right to organize, which really has benefits for both workers, employers, and the government. So I would say that our conversations are ongoing. They have been very productive, and I'm hoping that we will start to see some real progress in the labor law amendments in the coming months.
Good to know it's in a debating but win-win situation. That's really awesome. So, Lina, we are about to end the show, and my last question would be, what would be your message for the people of Bangladesh and U.S. commitment to promoting labor rights and equitable society?
Sure. Well, I would just like to close and summarize by saying why trade unions matter in Bangladesh and around the world. Unions represent democracy in action. They help to level the playing field between workers and employers, and they provide workers with a voice to negotiate for better working conditions and better wages. And there are many positive effects of trade unions of independent democratic trade unions for workers, employers, and the government. First, unions advance the interest of workers by improving wages, by making workplaces more safe, and by resolving workplace grievances in a peaceful, transparent manner. Second, unions improve industrial relations between workers and employers, which in effect increases productivity for companies. Third, unions support economic growth by reducing income inequality, by overcoming poverty, and they also help to build a middle class. So, the United States remains committed to working with the government of Bangladesh on its journey to a middle-income country status by strengthening these fundamental rights to organize and collectively bargain. And we think that this in turn will help ensure that economic growth is fair, inclusive, and broadly shared, that will help uplift all of the people of Bangladesh.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking with you, learning from you. And I believe people who will watch this show, they will understand more and the debate will be gone. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Hasib. It's been a real pleasure to be here today.
থ্যাংক ইউ দর্শক আমরা কথা বলছিলাম লীনা খানের সাথে আমরা কথা বলছিলাম শ্রম সংগঠন এবং শ্রম অধিকার কর্মীদের কাজের মাধ্যমে যে পরিবর্তন আসবে তা সামনে বাংলাদেশে নানাভাবে উপকৃত করবে এবং বাংলাদেশ যুক্তরাষ্ট্রের যে সম্পর্ক সেই সম্পর্কে আরও আপডেট করবে দেখা হবে মুখোমুখির অন্য কোনো পর্বে অন্য কোনো অতিথির সাথে তার আগ পর্যন্ত ভালো থাকুন সুস্থ থাকুন